At my nephew's graduation party, right in the middle of the celebration, my brother stood up, raised his glass, and said to Marcus, "The future of our family." Unlike some kids who walk away from opportunity and chase pipe dreams, Marcus actually followed through. The crowd chuckled, not loudly, but loud enough. It wasn't just a harmless toast. It had a target. My daughter, Amara, was sitting beside me in a soft green dress she'd spent hours choosing that morning. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. She didn't make a sound. I watched her take a deep breath, the kind that's meant to hold back tears. I looked around the yard, streamers everywhere, blue banners that read, "Congratulations, Marcus." Expensive catered food, champagne flutes with personalized ribbons. Richard, the perfect older brother, the overachiever, the successful architect with the luxury watch, was beaming like he'd designed the entire universe. And then there was me, the divorced community college professor who parked 3 streets away because my muffler had a hole the size of Texas. The mother of the girl who walked away from Stanford. But I wasn't embarrassed by Amara. Not once, not ever. They didn't know what she'd endured. They didn't see her stay up for days straight developing neural networks that her professors struggled to understand. They didn't hear the determination in her voice when she told me she needed to leave Stanford, not because the work was too hard, but because the path felt wrong, because she wanted to create something meaningful, not just collect credentials. But none of that registered today. What mattered was the way they snickered, the way they treated her story like it was already over. Then, as if the universe had finally had enough of their smug little party, a silver car pulled up outside the house. Nothing flashy, just elegant and precise. Darkened windows, silent engine. Nobody noticed at first until the passenger door opened and a woman in a tailored navy suit stepped out. She didn't hesitate or look uncertain. She walked directly through the open gate, past the decorations, through the balloon arch, and straight to our table. Conversations dropped away like someone had cut the power. She looked at Amara. "Dr. Amara Chen?" Amara lifted her chin. Her expression remained calm. She stood slowly and nodded. "Yes." The woman gave a respectful nod and continued. "We're here representing the Harvard Quantum Computing Initiative. Congratulations on becoming the youngest principal investigator in the program's history. If you're ready, we'll escort you to the keynote presentation." I don't think I remembered to breathe. I watched my brother's smile fade, his glass tilting slightly in his hand. Someone let out a surprised gasp, and Marcus froze with a forkful of cake halfway to his mouth. Amara tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked at me. She didn't smile, but I saw it in her eyes. That unspoken message, "I told you I'd find my way." Then she turned, gave the woman a nod, and walked beside her toward the car. No explanations, no triumphant speech, just quiet dignity. They laughed at her, they pitied her. They assumed they knew the end of her story, but they were wrong. They didn't even know which chapter she was on. The invitation arrived in a silver envelope with navy blue lettering. "You are cordially invited to celebrate Marcus Whitaker's graduation from Princeton University." There was no warmth to it, just formality, as if it had been mass-produced rather than personally sent. I stared at it for 2 days before responding. I knew exactly what this party would be. A showcase, a parade of accomplishments, a perfectly orchestrated moment for Richard to demonstrate how flawlessly he'd done everything. Career, house, son, wife, with the designer wardrobe. Richard had always been like that. Even when we were kids, he was the one with perfect grades while I was juggling 2 jobs to help Dad after Mom left. He wore tailored clothes and rolled his eyes when I showed up to family dinners in the same dress twice. Still, I accepted. Amara deserved to go, not because she owed anyone an explanation, but because hiding would only confirm what they already thought, that something had gone terribly wrong, that she had failed. When the day arrived, we got ready in comfortable silence. Amara put on the dress we'd found during one of our rare shopping trips. She ran her fingers through her short dark hair, brushed it neatly, and skipped the makeup. She looked young and determined and braver than she gave herself credit for. I wore a forest green blouse I hadn't touched since my last faculty interview. I didn't get the position, but I kept the blouse. It reminded me that I was still trying. On the drive there, I watched her through quick glances. Her gaze was fixed out the window, focused on a world she no longer felt connected to. I wanted to offer something profound and motherly, but every phrase I considered felt inadequate, too small. So I simply asked, "You okay?" She nodded once. "Fine." It wasn't fine, but I let it be. Richard's house looked like something from a real estate magazine. Brick facade, garden beds so immaculate they looked artificial. A custom banner stretched across the front entrance. Cars lined both sides of the street. I parked around the corner so no one would hear my muffler's rasp. Amara stepped out without hesitation, her shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. Inside the backyard, everything was exactly as expected. Bistro lights hung above cream-colored tables. There was a chocolate fountain and a mimosa bar with glasses already prepared. Marcus stood near the center, surrounded by friends in pressed shirts and summer dresses, laughing like nothing had ever been challenging in his life. Richard spotted us and waved, but his smile had an edge to it. I approached with Amara beside me, steeling myself for whatever was coming. "You made it," Richard said. "Wasn't sure you'd show." "We said we would," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. His eyes shifted to Amara. "And you look well. Time off can be good for someone figuring things out." Amara gave a polite smile but said nothing. I introduced Amara to a few relatives she hadn't seen since she was much younger. The conversations were shallow but layered with subtle tension. People said things like, "So what's next for you? And still on a break from school, huh?" As if she were stuck instead of evolving. There was music playing, something classical and light, but it couldn't drown out the weighted remarks. I noticed how people looked at Marcus with admiration and at Amara with quiet concern, like she was a cautionary tale whispered at family gatherings. Every few minutes, I found myself scanning the crowd, looking for safe spaces or friendly faces. There weren't many, just people who used to know us and thought they still did. Amara excused herself to get water and lingered by the dessert table, watching the speeches begin. I stayed back, arms crossed, pretending to listen as Richard's wife toasted Marcus's brilliance and dedication. When Richard stood to speak, I saw him look in our direction. Not directly at Amara, but close enough to draw attention. "Some young people just know what they want," he said, lifting his glass. "They don't waver, they stay committed, they complete what they begin." It wasn't subtle, it was calculated, a performance disguised as praise. Amara didn't react. She just took a sip from her cup and looked past the crowd. I saw the flicker in her expression. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hurt. It was something deeper, something that settled inside. That was when I realized we weren't just attending a graduation party. We were walking through a minefield. Richard always knew exactly how to wound someone without raising his voice. His words cut clean and swift, hidden behind polite tones and fake concern. He never needed to shout to humiliate someone, especially not me, and certainly not Amara. The party continued after the toasts. People moved about, filling plates with gourmet appetizers and slices of tiramisu. The speakers played soft jazz from a corner under a white tent. I stayed near Amara, not hovering, but close enough that she wouldn't feel entirely alone. She sat quietly at a table near the edge of the yard, shaded by a large oak tree. Her hands rested on the table, her eyes scanning the horizon, disconnected from the celebration flowing around her. Every now and then, someone would stop by and ask a question they didn't genuinely want answered. "So, Amara, what are you up to these days?" "Oh, taking some time off? That's probably smart. You've got plenty of time. Marcus already has his fellowship lined up, but everyone moves at their own pace, right?" She responded with simple nods or half smiles. She didn't lie. She didn't explain. She just weathered it piece by piece, the way only someone who's already been broken once knows how to endure. Then it happened. Richard came to the center of the yard, holding a glass of champagne, and cleared his throat. Everyone quieted quickly. He loved an audience, and now he had one. "I just want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate Marcus," he said, smiling broadly. "You all know how hard he's worked. Highest honors, full ride, fellowship, and now an offer from one of the top engineering firms in Boston. We are just so proud." People clapped. Photos were taken. Marcus beamed beside his father, perfectly framed by the sunlight and the glittering banner behind him. Richard wasn't finished. "I also want to say, not every journey looks like this. Some people take detours. Some, well, They wander a little longer. They try different things. Some even drop out, maybe to find themselves, and maybe, just maybe, they'll end up working at the mall. He didn't look at Amara, but every head in the crowd slowly turned in our direction. A ripple of laughter followed. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Just loud enough to wound. I looked at Amara. Her posture didn't change. Her hands remained still, her back straight. But I saw her jaw tighten. Her eyes dropped momentarily. She blinked twice. That was it. She didn't cry. She didn't leave. She sat there and absorbed every ounce of that moment. Something inside me broke. I stood halfway, caught between comforting her and confronting Richard, unsure which would protect her more. My instincts demanded that I shame Richard the way he had just shamed my daughter. But Amara reached across the table and gently touched my hand just once, and that stopped me. It was her way of saying don't. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because she didn't want to give them anything else to discuss. So I sat down. Around us, the chatter resumed. The insult had already been buried beneath compliments and party photos. People moved on, but I didn't. I couldn't. I watched Amara carefully. Her face remained composed, but I knew better. I knew the cost of being judged by people who didn't know the full story, who only saw the surface and thought they understood everything beneath. What none of them knew was that Amara hadn't left Stanford because she failed. She departed after receiving offers from multiple research labs, not because she couldn't handle the workload, but because she wanted more than a prestigious degree. She was working with cutting-edge quantum algorithms, consulting with tech companies on breakthrough applications, and writing papers that specialists had begun citing. But she hadn't told anyone yet, not because she was hiding, but because she didn't need their approval to validate her worth. Still, no mother wants to see her child ridiculed, especially not by family. Richard walked past us a few minutes later and leaned down just enough to whisper, "No hard feelings, sis. Just having a little fun." I stared at him. I didn't blink. I didn't nod. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction because I knew something he didn't. The truth was coming, and it was about to arrive right at his perfect little party. Amara didn't flinch. That was what struck me most. After Richard's comment, after the laughter, after the sideways glances and whispered remarks, she didn't storm off. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even look angry. She just sat there, her hands still resting on the table, her eyes quiet and fixed on something distant. But I could feel it. Something shifted in her. It wasn't dramatic or visible to anyone else, but I felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure. She had taken the hit and decided in that moment how she would respond, not with words, not with drama, but with presence. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low so only she could hear. "You okay?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she nodded once and said, "I'm not upset, I'm just done pretending." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so much time encouraging her to protect her peace, to rise above the noise, to let people think what they wanted. But I realized now that silence had a price. Every time she let them underestimate her, she had been carrying the weight of that misunderstanding. Today, she had reached her limit. She stood up slowly, smoothed the hem of her dress, straightened her shoulders. "I'm going to get some air," she said. I watched her walk away from the table, not toward the house or the food table, but toward the edge of the yard where the gate opened to the front driveway. I wanted to follow her, but I knew I needed to let her move on her own terms. This wasn't about me defending her anymore. This was about her stepping forward fully as herself. A few minutes passed, long enough for the party to return to its rhythm. People danced. Marcus posed for more pictures. Richard held court with a group of men near the grill, telling stories about his son's scholarship offers and how much his fellowship would pay. Then I heard it. A car engine, smooth and quiet, pulled up in front of the house. It wasn't blaring music or honking. It simply arrived and stopped. I saw a few people turn their heads toward the gate, curious. A sleek silver sedan with tinted windows sat parked by the curb. The kind of vehicle that didn't need to announce itself. The passenger door opened and a woman stepped out. She wore a tailored navy suit. She moved with purpose, but without hurry. Every step was deliberate, confident, assured. She wasn't someone coming to visit. She was someone sent to collect. Conversations trailed off. People paused mid-sentence, their eyes following her as she entered the backyard like she belonged there. I stood. My heart quickened, not in fear but in recognition. I didn't know who she was, but I knew exactly why she was here. She walked directly to where Amara stood, just inside the gate. She didn't stop to ask directions or search the crowd. She knew her, and Amara knew her. She addressed her with complete clarity. Dr. Amara Chen. The title landed like thunder in that yard. Not a nickname, not a courtesy, a title she had earned. Yes, Amara replied. We're here representing Harvard University's Quantum Computing Initiative. You're scheduled to deliver the keynote at the conference in 90 minutes. If you're ready, we'll escort you now. A hush fell over the backyard. You could hear the ice clinking in glasses. You could hear the soft wind rustling the tablecloths. No one moved. Amara looked over at me. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes locked onto mine and held. That glance said everything. It said, I told you I was building something. It said, I'm not hiding anymore. She turned to the woman, nodded once and said, I'm ready. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't look back at the people who had laughed. She just walked forward with the kind of quiet strength you can't fabricate. And I stayed behind, heart racing, chest full, watching my daughter walk into the world. Not as someone needing permission to belong, but as someone finally claiming her place in it. Amara didn't rush. She walked with measured steps, each one purposeful. The woman beside her opened the car door, and for a moment, Amara paused to glance back. Not at me, not at Richard, not at anyone in particular, but at the space she was leaving behind. Then she stepped inside. The car pulled away without fanfare, just the low purr of the engine and the soft crunch of tires on the driveway. And that was it. She was gone. But what she left behind hit harder than any speech, louder than any confrontation. Silence. Complete stunned silence. No music, no chatter, no fake laughing crowd. I stood still, my hands gripping the edge of the table in front of me. People stared at the driveway like they expected the car to return. Richard's mouth was half open, his glass frozen midair. Marcus stood next to him, confused and uncertain whether he was still the focus of attention. No one asked any questions right away, but I saw the looks. They weren't curious. They were ashamed, embarrassed. People who had chuckled at Richard's remark earlier now kept their heads down. One woman, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, walked past and murmured, "That was impressive," before disappearing behind the dessert table. Richard recovered first, of course. He laughed a little, forced and artificial, and said, "Well, I guess she didn't tell us she was going to give lectures now or whatever that was." He looked at me, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "You knew about that, didn't you? Why wouldn't you mention it?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "Because she didn't need to prove anything to you." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm her mother," I added, "not her publicist." Richard's face tightened. That perfect mask of superiority slipped just for a moment. He opened his mouth like he might defend himself, but no words came. He turned away and pretended to adjust a speaker, but the moment was already out of his hands. I sat back down and took a sip of water. Across the yard, people were starting to talk again, but the tone had changed. There was no more smugness, no backhanded compliments or cheap shots. What lingered now was the memory of that title, Dr. Amara Chen, spoken by a woman in a suit who didn't smile or soften the words. She had delivered them like a fact because that's exactly what they were. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated. A message from Amara. "At the convention center now. Just wanted to say thank you for being there today. I didn't realize how much I needed you until I saw your face when she said my name." I stared at that message for a while, not because I was surprised, but because I was proud beyond what words could contain. I didn't raise her to chase validation. I didn't raise her to fit into narrow expectations. I raised her to think deeply, to move with intention, to be brave in spaces that weren't built to accommodate her brilliance. And today, she had stood in the very place where people once doubted her and reminded them who she really was. I watched Marcus gather with his friends again. He smiled for a few photos, but there was a stiffness in his posture now, like he couldn't quite relax. The celebration continued, but something fundamental had changed. It was no longer the only story in the room. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Amara didn't wear a cap and gown that day. She didn't get handed a diploma in front of her family. She didn't receive applause from a crowd trained to cheer for the expected. But she got something better. Recognition. Real, earned, undeniable recognition from people who mattered in front of people who didn't think she deserved it. That's what made the moment powerful. Not the surprise, not the car, not the title. The power came from the truth that had been quietly waiting to emerge. And when it did, it didn't need to shout. It simply stood tall, said her name, and changed everything. After the car pulled away, the party didn't end immediately, but it felt like it had. People tried to ease back into casual conversation. They hovered near the food tables, laughed a little too loudly, swayed to the music, but the air had shifted. The performance was over. Whatever act people had been putting on, whether pride, pity, or indifference, it was no longer enough to cover what they had just witnessed. Amara was gone, but the truth of who she was had remained. I sat quietly, my plate untouched, watching the interactions unfold. No one approached me directly at first. They didn't know what to say. Most of them had spent the last hour treating my daughter like a disappointment. Now they didn't know how to rewrite the script quickly enough to keep pace with reality. Eventually, a few came over. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Your girl's really something." Another relative, one of Richard's in-laws, nodded and said, "You must be so proud." I just thanked them calmly without pretending any of it mattered more than the truth we already knew. Richard avoided me for the rest of the party. He stayed near Marcus, who was trying to smile through the weight of no longer being the most accomplished person in the room. It wasn't his fault. Marcus had done the work. He had earned his moment. But what Richard never understood was that success doesn't shine brighter by casting shadows on someone else. Amara didn't need to compete. She didn't need to impress anyone. She had already built something more valuable than applause. She had built resilience. When I got home that night, I found her bedroom door slightly open and her desk lamp still on. She wasn't there, but her laptop was open and her notebook sat beside it. A page of diagrams and equations was half completed, a stylus resting across the tablet like she had just stepped away for a moment. That's how I knew this wasn't the end of a story. It was the middle of something still unfolding. She called me that night from the convention center. Her voice was light, steady, even a little amused. They asked if I wanted to review my introduction. I said no, I want the work to speak first. I smiled. I'm proud of you. There was a brief pause before she replied, I know. It wasn't arrogant, it was confident. She said it like someone who had earned it, like someone who finally believed it. In the days that followed, the news began to spread. A few people from the party reached out, pretending they had always recognized her potential. One even asked if Amara would mentor their daughter about STEM programs. I forwarded the message without comment. Amara replied courteously. She had nothing to prove and nothing to settle. That's the difference between a point made and a point proven. I thought about Richard. I don't know if he ever admitted to himself what he did that day. Maybe he told himself it was harmless. Maybe he convinced himself it wasn't personal. But I don't need an apology, because the moment that car pulled up and that woman said her name, Amara received everything Richard could never take away from her again. Not acceptance, not validation, but respect. Real, earned respect. And I learned something too. As a mother, you fight so hard to shield your child from pain. But there comes a moment when protection becomes permission. Permission to rise, to speak, to walk into the room as themselves and stop apologizing for their path. That day, I didn't defend Amara. I didn't intervene. I didn't try to rewrite the story. I just stood still and let her own it. And she did. So let them laugh, let them gossip, let them draw conclusions before the story is finished. Because when the truth arrives, it doesn't ask for permission. It simply walks in, says your name, and waits for you to rise. And my daughter rose. That day taught me something I'll never forget. Not every victory is loud. Not every triumph comes with cheers. Some of the most powerful moments are quiet. A young woman standing up after being dismissed. A car pulling up at precisely the right time. A name spoken with the respect it always deserved. If this story reminded you of someone you believe in, someone who's been doubted, underestimated, or laughed at, I hope you share this with them. Let them know their story isn't over. Let them know their moment is coming. And if this meant something to you, if it resonated with your own experience, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories like this. Stories about strength, truth, and the quiet moments that change everything. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.